Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second. I want to thank everyone for coming today. My name is Ana Fadic, and I am the Vice President of Men's Health Network. We're a nonprofit here in DC, and we are happy to be hosting this briefing with our colleagues from Zero, the project, or the End of Prostate Cancer, and AUA. We have a special guest here today, Congressman Payne Jr. is here, so we will have him open us up here today with just a few words. Congressman? Good morning, how are you? Good to see you. All right, we'll have
Well, I guess timing's everything. I really feel an honor and a privilege to be here today to discuss such a important men's health issue. I'd just like to say good afternoon to everyone. And as I stated, it's an honor to be here with the Men's Health Network, Congressional Men's Health Caucus, and the Prostate Cancer Task Force. You know, we know cancer is one of the great public health challenges of our time. Almost every family in America has been touched by cancer. Over 1.5 million new cancer cases are expected to be diagnosed this year. As some of you might know, the issue of cancer became personal to me in a real way. My mother, the late Hazel Payne, lost her battle to brain cancer when I was 4 years old. And my father, the late Congressman Donald Payne Sr., lost his battle to colorectal cancer just 5 years ago. And I followed him into Congress, took his seat. So it's probably one of the worst ways to become a member of Congress. And after losing my father, it became my mission to do everything I can to raise awareness, educate, and help save lives. That's why I'm so glad to be here with all of you today. Fighting cancer takes a comprehensive approach, and at the center of that approach is preventative health care. Many lives can be saved when an alternative to their health needs, attentive to their health needs, and don't wait too long before seeing a doctor and receiving preventive screening. After my father passed, I decided I needed to get myself screened. And, you know, for probably many of you were not familiar with my father, but he was considered the foremost authority on Africa in the United States Congress, and was really the impetus and the person that got President Bill Clinton to go to Africa in the 90s, and was called Father Africa. So he was a very educated man, a history teacher by trade, and in public life for 23 years as a member of Congress, but was never screened. And so a person of that education and brilliance just never got screened. And so after his death, about 5 months or so later, I was over 50, so I figured maybe I needed to go get screened, because had he not died, I probably would not have been screened in a timely manner myself. And so once I went for that first colonoscopy, he died in March and I went in December. I used to tell people I go for my birthday now, I have a colonoscopy. And they found 13 polyps. And thank goodness they were all removed with no issue. But I was lucky because I really was late in getting screened. Now I get screened every year as I stated, a birthday gift to myself. As a co-chair of the Congressional Men's Health Caucus, I know that too often men are unwilling to be proactive about their health. Part of the reason is the stigma around cancer screening. Many people think that the process is too invasive. This is particularly true for older generations like my father's, but my response is be a man and get tested. You might just save a life, which is your own. Now it's not enough just to tell someone they should take control of their health. People need to be able to access quality care and information that is needed to make the smart health decisions in your life. Congress has such an important role to play here. One of the things I'm working on in Congress is finding bipartisan solutions to financial barriers to testing. Earlier this year, I joined Congressman Charlie Dent and Leonard Lance in introducing the Removing Barriers to Colorectal Cancer Screening Act of 2017. Too often individuals are forced to forego screening because of unreasonably high costs. The Removing Barriers to Colorectal Cancer Screening Act waives cost sharing under Medicare for preventive colonoscopies, even if a polyp or tissue is removed. By reducing disincentives for screening, the bill will improve health outcomes and save money for both seniors and taxpayers. Last Congress, I also introduced a resolution to protect the quality of life for prostate cancer survivors. Prostate cancer is the third leading cause of cancer death among men. 1 in 7 men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer in his lifetime, and more than 2.9 million men in the United States have been diagnosed with prostate cancer at some point in their lives. African American men are at an increased risk of being diagnosed with and dying from this disease. What this resolution did was call on Congress to maintain important quality of life benefits for Medicare beneficiaries and veterans suffering from significant urological trauma as a result of cancer treatment therapies. Today we have a real opportunity to accelerate advances in cancer prevention, detection, and treatment, and to decrease the number of people suffering from this disease. If we're going to win the fight against cancer, we need to provide the resources necessary to develop new treatments, and we need to accelerate research that is underway. This, of course, means continuing to fund the Department of Defense Prostate Cancer Research Program. This is a tremendous value in this program. There's tremendous value in the program, and cutting-edge scientific work is taking place, but we need to increase the funding to broaden access, information, and support research across the cancer community. With the new administration, we need to remain vigilant in advocating for cancer research funding. What is also of great concern to me is the hostility of President Trump and his administration to minority communities. Health disparities are stark, especially in the African American communities, where life expectancies are lower and infant mortality rates are higher than among white Americans. Although the overall racial disparity in cancer death rates is decreasing, in 2007, the death rate for all cancers combined continued to be 32% higher in African American men and 16% higher in African American women than in their white counterparts. And African American men are 1.6 times as likely to get prostate cancer as white men. It is essential to address the numerous factors that contribute to minority health disparities: poverty, environmental threats, inadequate access to health care, and educational inequities, to name a few. There is no indication that this administration intends to address these challenges in any real way. That is why we need to do what we can to keep up the fight and continue to make our voices heard. Continue to speak out and demand accountability and transparency from all elected officials. Mobilize public opinion against the administration and the Republican Congress. And if we don't make cancer a national priority, we have not done our job. We have to make sure that pressure is felt. We have to remain united. Fighting cancer requires sustained efforts at all levels to raise awareness and ensure individuals and their families have high quality and affordable access to screening and treatment. That is why this briefing is so important. And again, I want to thank you for a few minutes and allowing me to address you. And let's continue the fight. It's important to this entire country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. Okay.
Great. Well, it was a great start to the meeting. Once again, my name is Anna, and I'm with Men's Health Network. And we are a nonprofit organization that educates men and their family about the importance of men's health issues. And we handle all of men's health, but today we're specifically focusing on prostate cancer. So we applaud the United States Preventive Services Task Force and their recommendation for improving the grade of prostate cancer screening to a grade C for men, ages 55 to 69, but we have concerns about the grades for other demographics and the impacts that these grades would have on men who would benefit from early detection of prostate cancer. We're pleased that the task force distinguishes between the screening event and potential harms that might result from follow-up tests and treatment. This is an important distinction for the general public who have inadvertently been led to believe that screening itself is harmful. I'm joined today to do this panel discussion, and it's going to be open Q&A, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. We do have a mic that's going to be floating around to ask any of our panelists. We have Drew Salins, who is with Zero. We have Dr. Lynch, who is himself a prostate cancer survivor, but also deals with prostate cancer patients. Mr. Tony Goodman, who is a local DC colleague of ours, who is going to speak on his experience with prostate cancer, and Dr. Tom Berger, who will specifically address the information that was left out addressing Vietnam veterans and Agent Orange exposure. So just to familiarize you all with what is going on here, the USPSTF provides grade definitions for different cancers and treatments and screenings. Anything that is an A or a B, as you see here, is tied to the Affordable Care Act, and so these A and B recommendations are they mean no copays and mandatory insurance coverage. So if you have any screenings that fall under A or B, they're covered by your insurance company. A C, which is what we're going to be discussing today, which has been recommended for prostate cancer, means that you have to have a conversation with your doctor. It's dependent on certain issues. We'll go more into that. But D, which is where prostate cancer was, Drew will be talking about this since 2012. D means don't screen, that there are more harms than there are benefits. And then I means inconclusive, and prostate cancer used to be at an I, so inconclusive means that there's not enough evidence to support for or against screening. So the way that we see it is this is a great move to a grade C because it means see your doctor, as opposed to the D for don't do it. Drew?
Thanks, Anna. So as Anna said, I'm going to review sort of the history of where the USPSTF recommendation was and where we are today. So back in 2008, the USPSTF gave an I recommendation for most men screening for prostate cancer, but gave a D recommendation for men over 70. And that's unfortunately where we are today as well. But between 2008 and really 2011, things got worse. The USPSTF came out with a D recommendation for all men, meaning the harm outweighed the benefit of screening. And what they were saying is, if you get screened, you're likely to have a false positive, you're going to get a biopsy, and then maybe you'll get a prostatectomy or radiation treatment when you shouldn't have. And there's a lot of steps in between getting a blood test, which is all the PSA is, and electing for surgery or radiation or prostatectomy. But they sort of said, there's no gap in between that, and the PSA can lead to these harms. So actually, I was working with Men's Health Network back in 2011 on this issue, and the big deal about the grade at that time was also that the grades were tied through the Affordable Care Act to insurance coverage and copay coverage if they got an A or a B recommendation. So not only does it have this D recommendation from a task force, but now it's not mandatorily covered by the Affordable Care Act. So I came back into the prostate cancer community in 2016, and lo and behold, we're still fighting this issue 5 years later. And we still had the D recommendation. Some literature said that the metastatic cases were going up. You might not be able to tie it directly to the recommendation, but you could also, there's also an inference that since the recommendation came out, men weren't getting screened as much, and so more metastatic disease was being caught later. So recently, after many years of work, the USPSTF changed their grade to a C. And what they're saying now is, because of an increase in active surveillance is one of the factors that men should discuss the benefits and harms with their doctor in a personalized conversation. And that's a good step in the right direction. It's at least a message that we can all take out that says no longer does this task force recommend against prostate cancer screening. They're saying have a conversation with your doctor about your personal risks and benefits. One of the problems is, from Zero's perspective, and I think the other organizations may agree, is that it's only for men 55 to 69. And so what's the arbitrary cutoff at 70? How does the data really conclude that a man in his 70s or 80s shouldn't have that same conversation? And also, there's no carve-out for African Americans or men with a family history, which are two high-risk groups. And the reason that the USPSTF gave that there's no carve-out is because there's not enough data. Okay, well, it's really unfortunate that we weren't able to enroll African Americans and men with a family history in enough trials to generate that data. But common sense would lead us to believe that we know those risk groups are at a higher risk for the disease, both getting it and dying from it. So is there any leeway in there to make a recommendation based on what we know about the prevalence and mortality of the disease? What Zero recommends and is pushing for, and with other groups as well, is let's not give the USPSTF any doubt when the next 5-year recommendation comes up. Let's make sure that African Americans and men with a family history have enrolled in those trials, and that researchers have designed those trials, so when the next screening recommendation comes up, that data is there. So with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Lynch.
Thank you very much. Certainly a pleasure to be here. As I said, I'm a prostate cancer survivor myself. I had surgery 15 years ago. I also have a brother-in-law who had prostate cancer, a brother who had prostate cancer, and one brother-in-law who died from prostate cancer. I've been in practice now for 38 years, and most of my practice deals with treating patients and diagnosing patients with prostate cancer. So I was in practice before PSA was even known to exist or existed. I've seen the changes that resulted in PSA. Prior to PSA, most men who were diagnosed were done on the basis of an abnormal rectal exam. Probably 2/3 of those men had metastatic disease at the time of diagnosis. So I've seen the benefits of PSA screening and testing. I disagreed with the 2012 recommendations when they came out because I thought that the literature that they used to make this decision, there was some flaws, especially in the one PLCO trial. Subsequent to that, I have personally diagnosed men who, with metastatic prostate cancer, whose screening had stopped because their physician went with the USPSTF recommendations. We've actually published from our own institutions that the percentage of men with more advanced cancer following surgery went up after the 2012 recommendations than they were before. And I think everybody started to notice less screening and more metastatic disease. So I was glad to see them change the recommendations. The AUA is glad to see them change the recommendations. I don't still agree with 100% of them, but they match closely our guidelines. This is, again, 55 to 69. And I want to stress again, these are patients with no symptoms of anything, no risk factors. So there's a whole different, as we said, group out there who deserves to be screened and deserves to have the shared decision making. We agree that it needs to be a discussion between the patient and the physician. All things should be a discussion between the patient and physician. We like some of the changes that they've made. They're now accepting public comments. They asked the AUA to provide them a list of 3 names for someone to review and make recommendations on their literature and their study program. We did that. They did accept one of the names who had an opportunity to make a review and make some, well, he put in some corrections and some additions. Whether all of them are reviewed or not, I don't know. But certainly it's a step in the right direction. But it can also change at the whim of a new task force chair. Nothing is codified. We all need to get them to put this in a law so that the process can be improved going forward. I think it's going to make a huge difference and an important difference. I don't necessarily agree with the D for men over 70. I have plenty of men in the early 70s in my practice who have no significant risk factors, who are very healthy, very active, and who really wish to be screened with the shared decision making. But it shouldn't be a government telling patients who can be screened for what, realistically. That should be up to the patient and physician. So we're glad with the changes that have been made, but we think there's still a way to go, and we need to put this into law.
It's a blessing and an honor to be able to speak and share my personal testimony with you. About 7 years ago, I found out that I had prostate cancer, and I actually found out by mistake. I had just moved into a new house in Elk Ridge, Maryland, and as I was walking up and down the steps, I was having shortness of breath and pains in my chest, and so I thought I was having a heart attack. So I went to my doctor, and my doctor did not see me, but a nurse practitioner did, and this nurse practitioner, she was an excellent health professional. She was very thorough. So she checked my breathing, she checked my heart, and she also did a blood test. And so when she did the blood test, she had checked my PSA, and it came back a week later, the PSA level was 2.8 versus the previous year, it being 1.9. So she recommended I go to a cardiologist, and she also recommended I go and see a urologist. When I went to the urologist, he said, well, I don't think you have cancer. That was the first thing he said. But he was a very good urologist. He said, but I'm very proactive. What I want to do is schedule you for a biopsy. So he scheduled me for a biopsy about 2 or 3 months later, and he did 12 tissue samples. Took 12 tissue samples, 9 were benign and 3 were malignant. So we discussed all the different treatment options. One thing he told me, he said, you know, you could do active surveillance, or you could have your prostate removed, or you could do brachytherapy, all these different treatment options. I chose to do active surveillance. Basically, you just wait and see and constantly monitor my PSA level. So every 3 months, I would go back to him and check my PSA level, and he would ask me different questions, how I'm doing, and all those different things. So the next year, we did another biopsy. We didn't find anything. Another year went by. We did another biopsy, and we found another malignant cell. So at that point, it was 4. So I decided to have my prostate removed. And I had surgery at Johns Hopkins. It was basically in and out surgery. I stayed at the hospital one day, and I was home the next day. I went through basically like a month's recovery, and it didn't necessarily take a month for me to walk around and do different things. I was able to do that earlier. But what I want to say out of all of this is, it's important that you, as a male or your loved ones, get annual physicals, but also get your prostate checked. Do a PSA level test reading, and to see, you know, how you are. And if it's just so important, because had it not been for the other symptoms and things I was going through, and not having that health professional be thorough in checking me, And then recommending that I go to a urologist, I would have not known that I had cancer. And so I've been cancer-free for 4 years now. And I'm basically in the epitome of good health. Since that time, I've also had an opportunity to speak to many men in my church. Some of them have been diagnosed with prostate cancer. One of them had prostate cancer surgery about 4 years ago. They're cancer-free. Another one was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He did brachytherapy. My oldest brother, he was a vet. He's had prostate cancer at least twice in the last 10 to 15 years. The first time he had it, he went through chemo and radiation. The last time, he's been doing hormone therapy, but he's doing very, very well. So it's important that men take care of themselves, that men get annual physicals, that men get screened for their prostate health and to find out what's going on. And so I would just like to say that it's important for men to check their health and see health professionals. And so my survival rate is wonderful. I had a great group of people surrounding me, my wife, my family, my church, friends praying for me, and others. So thank you again for having the opportunity to share.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Berger, Executive Director of the Veterans Health Council for Vietnam Veterans of America. VVA and the Health Council are particularly concerned because there's been no mention of exposure to cancer-causing chemicals like Agent Orange and other phenoxy herbicides. It took us a while, and we had to fight, almost literally fight, with the Veterans Health Administration to finally admit that exposure to these kinds of chemicals places the person, that is the veteran, at higher risk for prostate cancer and a number of other life-threatening health problems. So, our opinion is that the determination of the USPTFS should be reflected to no less than a B grade rating by the group. Now, as several of my colleagues here have mentioned, the grade has been upped from D to C for people in the 55 to 69 age group. We also find that disturbing. We know that prostate cancer, in a number of cases, is slow acting. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to Vietnam veterans, we, along with our colleagues in the African American community and people with a family history, okay, are at that same high level of risk. And thus we believe that the grade for the older group should be raised as well. Now, part of the problem that we see in the veterans community is that we're not reaching out enough. For example, I don't know how many of you in the audience know that only about 40% of America's veterans use the Veterans Health Administration for their health care. So 60% aren't going to the VHA. They either have no insurance or they have private insurance. And there's a lot of discrepancy amongst the figures that are thrown around relative to those two groups. Nevertheless, the fact remains that Vietnam vets are at higher risk for prostate cancer. So with that, I'll turn to the Q&A session, but first I want to thank my colleagues, particularly the Men's Health Network, for supporting this effort today. And I want to give a shout out to a personal friend in the audience who's done a lot of work with veterans regarding prostate cancer, and that's Dr. Artie Shelton, who's sitting in the front row here. Thanks for coming today, Artie.
Just before we open it up for questions, we're talking a lot about prostate cancer today and the prostate cancer recommendation because it's been one of the more controversial screening recommendations to come out of the USPSTF. But moving forward, there's a bill that the American Urological Association has been working on and Zero and MHN have been supporting called the USPSTF Transparency and Accountability Act. And that piece of legislation is sort of like the rising tide that would lift all ships, right? Because it would require that a specialist from the disease state that's being reviewed is actually on the task force. So just to clarify for the staffers in the room, right now the task force is made up of primary care physicians, like even pediatricians, that are making recommendations and reviewing the data for something like prostate cancer. So for prostate cancer, we would advocate that a urologist and a medical oncologist would be on that task force. Now, what was great about this chairwoman who just actually stepped off the task force is she, later in the process, involved the AUA and had a urologist do an evidence review, but he wasn't actually on the task force. She also came to the Prostate Health Education Network, which is a African American prostate cancer advocacy group. She came to their summit. She also came to our summit at Zero, so she was very engaged. But here's the problem: is she has already rolled off of that task force, and so what if we don't get an engaged chairperson this next time around? We need to codify the actions of the task force into a law like the USPSTF Transparency and Accountability Act. And that's, you know, from a staffer perspective, that's what we're trying to ingrain in you today is here's what worked with the prostate cancer screening recommendation, sort of the history of it, and how it affects our disease state. But there are many, many diseases that the USPSTF makes recommendations on, and we want to make sure that all of those disease groups and people affected by those diseases benefit from an actual specialist being on the task force and transparency from the task force as they go through their processes.
So we'll start. Does anyone have any questions to give to anyone on the panel? Oh, sure. Artie?
Yes, thank you very much for an outstanding panel. I'm Artie Sheldon with FIN, Prostate Health Education Network. Just a comment, you know, Tom Farrington, the president and CEO, we're very concerned, as you're saying, about the data, that we need to make some changes for African American men, you know, with the prostate cancer. So he's being very aggressive, or FIN is being very aggressive now in getting African American men involved in clinical trials. And that's the only way we're going to go ahead and get the data over the next 5 years, you know, to have an impact on the task force. So I just want to let the panel know that we're being very aggressive in making this happen.
Well, I know that, just to comment on that, with when the recommendations had come out in 2012 against the screening for prostate cancer when it got a D, we had a lot of members in the community that would come to our events and say, well, you know, we heard on the news that if you do a screening, you get prostate cancer, and I don't want to get prostate cancer. So there's this miscommunication. So it's a way that, you know, we need to work on our communication to the public. And so, Dr. Lynch, would you be able to tell us, when that recommendation had come out in 2012 against the screening for prostate cancer, did you see a huge decline of patients coming to the physicians' offices requesting prostate screenings? And do you think that now, because of the change, that there's going to be enough media around it and enough buzz? I know that our groups, definitely FEN, Zero, AUA, and MHN, will be advocating for men to go out and get screened at different events. Do you think that we're going to see an uptick in patients coming to get screened?
I certainly hope so, and I think it's incumbent on us, again, to get the word out so that happens. I mean, I definitely saw a decrease in the amount of screening or testing for it, if you will, that happened after 2012, and I have the example from my practice of seeing several men with metastatic prostate cancer who their internist stopped getting PSAs in 2012, and now they're actually getting them again. I already know that because I see patients with them frequently. So, again, I think it's going to make a huge difference, so I think we need to keep publicizing it and get it codified.
Question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this discussion. I think it's been very timely, and especially I want to address one of the points that was made about the VA system and about African Americans. So we actually at BioReference and Aqua Health have just completed a clinical trial in the VA system where we found that there was a median PSA that was about 50% higher than what we found in our previous validation trial for our test, which was the 4K score. And we also found that the incidence of aggressive prostate cancer, high grade, was actually much higher in the VA system, about 36% of those biopsies that were done in our trial versus 22% in the validation trial that we did. So I think what you guys are talking about is extremely important. In the VA system, our trial had about 56% African American population. And so, going again to the point that these are important demographics to be looked at, and hopefully we can progress in giving them the proper help.
And I think Dr. Berger wanted to.
Thanks for that update. I mentioned in my comments about a fight that we had with the VA, and it coincides with what Dr. Lynch was talking about in 2012. There actually was a memo that I had obtained internal within the VA from a person who's no longer there, fortunately, okay, instructing hospital directors to refuse screening. Now, screening for prostate cancer is one of the recommended tests for people attempting to join what we call what the VA calls the Agent Orange Registry. There's a list of things they should test you for if you choose to join that registry, and prostate cancer is one of them. But there actually was a directive that went out. And so what I referred to as the fight, when I got that memo, that's when the fight started within the VA. And as a result, as I also said, okay, the VA has come around, but as you just heard, okay, the tests on veterans, okay, particularly Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange, and it wasn't just used in Vietnam, okay, it was used in other places, including here in the United States, all right, have resulted in a high number of our vets of Vietnam era with prostate cancer.
Let me just make a comment. I think the AUA has what's called an Aqua registry, in which it's a large registry of patients with prostate cancer. So we're hoping to get those African American numbers up through that system as well.
What's the name of it?
It's Aqua registry. It's part of the AUA.
Hi, I work for the George Washington Cancer Center largely on LGBT health issues, and so I'm curious to see curious in the panel's thoughts of any efforts now or in the future to possibly incorporate gay, bisexual, and transgender women health concerns within guidelines and screenings.
Yeah. I can tell you that as I serve on an advisory committee for the VA that is looking at veterans' health issues, and it includes LGBTQ members. So, but it covers a range of health issues, but prostate cancer is definitely included in that range of health issues.
Okay, so you keep talking about this C grade. Is that final, or I mean, is there more that can be done? Can it change?
So the C grade that had recently come out is a draft recommendation. So we had, the community had until May 8th, which was last Monday, to submit comments. So all of our groups have submitted comments to the task force around what we thought was good and what we thought could use some help. Definitely the inclusion of more African Americans and understanding those high-risk populations, those of Vietnam who were serving in Vietnam, anybody exposed to herbicides, at-risk men who have a family history, and those that are African American descent. So we did make comments for those. The draft recommendation will now be, all the comments will be taken into consideration, and then the draft recommendation should become final, hopefully maybe at the end of this year, if not the start of next year. Definitely, we'll be putting out news whenever that does come out. So currently, it's not the final; it's still a draft. Other questions? Any questions?
Although this is certainly an improvement, again, there's a way to go yet with the task force. Again, I think the bill needs to be put into practice and put into law so it's codified and it's not up to the whim of a chair. Our representative reviewed the literature and submitted comments and recommendations in writing, but there's no way to know which of those comments and recommendations were taken. It's not an open dialogue. You're putting a piece of paper in behind closed doors. So I would like to see more open dialogue between the task force and specialty groups and patient groups going forward. Just like every other law on Capitol Hill, there's a record. Everything is done in open meetings, so I would like to see the bill push that too.
I just want to piggyback on what my colleague just said. In the studies that were done, or a collection of data, if you will, which is sort of a mega collection of data. The data from the VA on vets with prostate cancer was not part of that. Why didn't they use those data? Okay? I don't know. I don't know why they didn't, and never got any answers when I asked people down at the VA. So, but there's a couple of important studies out there that need to be included. And as my colleague just said, let's look at it all and get people involved who really have the data and or the personal experiences.
I want to share a little story dealing with a friend of mine. He just recently passed from prostate cancer. This man was the epitome of health. 97 years old. October, he would have been 97. And he died about 3 weeks ago from prostate cancer. What could have been done? Had he maybe gone to a medical doctor and had checkups regularly, maybe he would still be living even longer to 100, 101. But he passed from advanced stage of prostate cancer. But then you have many stories of men who were checked in time and who did get proper treatment that are still living.
Yeah, so again, for the staffers, Dr. Lynch made a good point. The bill would subject the USPSTF to FACA so that they would have to put federal notices in the Federal Register, define comment periods, and that would all be codified and part of law. Right now, again, it's done at their whim and out of goodwill, but we want to make sure that that's codified. And the other part of the bill, the USPSTF Transparency and Accountability Act, is it requires coordination with industry as well as other federal agencies. So we just heard about the OPCO study in the VA, and it's not clear to me whether that data was taken under consideration by the USPSTF. This bill would have the USPSTF talk to the National Cancer Institute, talk to industry, talk to nonprofit organizations about what research is ongoing and make sure that that was all included. So that's another benefit of HR 539.
I have one other minor gripe about it, what they could do differently. If you look up at the makeup of the task force, it's internists, family physicians, psychiatrists, pediatricians, obstetrics, and gynecology. Who's missing? Correct. There's nobody. We represent men's health as urologists, much like an obstetrician and gynecologist represents women's health. So there really should be somebody on that task force that represents men's health issues.
Wasn't one of the recommendations,
Yes.
they're not supposed to add a urologist?
Well, the recommendation was to add specialists, but we talked about it at the congressional testimony, but I didn't hear a lot of support from my co-witnesses.
So something, and maybe Drew can discuss more about it, that is important is that we see here is the need for research and getting more of these young students in colleges going into research and doing research on prostate cancer. We understand that currently there is the PSA test and the digital rectal exam for prostate cancer. But down the line, there very may well be a new test that comes out, and there are researchers out there that are striving to get to that point. Drew, do you want to talk about the current funding for prostate cancer research and where we are with that?
Sure. So recently, as part of the appropriations bill, the prostate cancer research program at the Department of Defense received a $10 million increase, which is the first increase that it had in over a decade. So we're very happy about that. The prostate cancer research program at the Department of Defense is not just basic research. It has, you can trace research for 3 advanced prostate cancer drugs back to the research that was done at the DoD, as well as a genomic test that recently came out. So when we talk about ensuring that we have the data on the next go-around for USPSTF, that type of funding from the federal government is obviously important. The clinical trials rally that the Prostate Health Education Network is doing is critically important. The industry research that OPCO is doing is critically important. It's going to take all of us to develop this data in nonprofit, in government, and in for-profit to make sure that we have data the next time around when the PSA is reviewed. And as Anna alluded to, hopefully the research will lead to a better screening tool than the PSA so that we won't have to have this debate, but we'll just have a solid, proven screening tool.
Just one other comment. The treatment and diagnosis of prostate cancer has changed a lot since 2012. We try not to biopsy everybody who has an elevated PSA. We look at all kind of other markers, look at PSA velocity to really see who really does and doesn't need a biopsy. And I would say certainly in most academic centers, anybody who is diagnosed with low volume, low grade prostate cancer is on active surveillance. We don't treat nearly as many patients as we used to. We more actively follow them. So there clearly is still risk from biopsy and risk from treatments, but I think our association has gone a long way in educating our members on the proper way to do all of this. And I think we'll continue to do that, and we will see new tests come out in addition to PSA that will be very helpful.
Dr. Berger, with all the recent veterans that are coming back from war and the exposures that they've been exposed to, different and somewhat similar to Agent Orange, and they're finding that these veterans are coming back with their own types of health conditions and new health conditions that are arising. Do you think that what the task force is recommending now and getting people to come in, do you think there's going to be more veterans who will be taking advantage of the VA system, and actually will the doctors be asking questions like, did you serve in this war, that war, and were you exposed to these herbicides, to look for indications of potentially prostate cancer or any other male-specific cancers?
Well, there are a couple of questions there. Let me answer the last part first. And that is, some of you staffers in particular may have heard of military history being included in people's electronic health records. That is to say, there are no national efforts at the present time, but I know they have passed legislation in New York and a couple of other states that require all physicians or clinicians also to ask the following questions. Did you ever serve in the U.S. military? And there's a reason we ask it that way rather than saying, are you a veteran? Because women veterans in particular don't like to indicate that they're a veteran, all right? And there are people who don't serve in combat who don't consider themselves veterans, okay? So we ask the question that way. The second one is, if so, I'll just put the 3 other questions there. When and where, okay, and what was your MOS, your military occupational specialist? So, with those questions, there's a great deal of epidemiological information that can be gleaned. The VA doesn't ask those questions, although we have received assurances from the new secretary, Dr. Shulkin, that will be in place and operating by the end of this calendar year at every one of the 154 to 161, depending on whom you ask at the VA, facilities around the country. That's great. We need it at the local level too, in the private sector, if you will, and in public health to answer the kinds of questions that Anna was alluding to. Now, what we're finding relative to the comparison, if you will, between presentations at the VA for medical conditions between the generations, that is Gulf plus, because you know the first Gulf War is considered part of the current ongoing Iraq-Afghan wars as well, and Vietnam, okay? Vietnam veterans present with about 4 to 5 conditions. The newer vets, the kids as we call them, okay, double digits. So we like to think some of it's due to education about taking advantage of a VA healthcare system. At the same time, it shows that there's other things going on. We have concerns about the new generation's exposure to pesticides. I mean, in the early days of the war in the big sandbox, okay, our troops were wearing anti-flea collars, okay, because of the bugs over there, the insects and stuff. Then DOD said, wait a minute, that could be harmful because they contain bad pesticides. So then they started treating the uniforms with pesticides. So we have some concerns about that kind of thing. There's also, of course, concerns about exposure to depleted uranium, which, that's bad stuff. And some other diseases that are found locally in those parts of the world. And I don't just mean things associated with your military, but parasites and those kinds of things that show up. So obviously, we have a great deal of hope that in the new secretary, as he has said, that he wants to open up care for all veterans and do it as quickly as you can. But we also know that this country is facing a shortage of medical personnel across the board. And so part of our efforts are, at least at the Veterans Health Council, is getting medical schools to talk about, okay, service in the military and what they should do in terms of asking their patients once they get their degrees and certifications and what have you, where they served, when they served, and what was their MOS. That's really important to do that. There's so much epidemiological information that could be gleaned from just asking those 4 questions that would put us, I think, steps further in the pathways of solving or curing some of our diseases. And I'll end by saying, look at Hep C, okay?
Great, if we can just get the speakers to make some final comments.
So again, my final comments are the takeaway for the staffers in the room. There'll be a Dear Colleague letter circulating about the USPSTF Transparency and Accountability Act and the process for the recent prostate cancer draft recommendation. We hope that you'll put that Dear Colleague letter as well as the information presented today in front of your bosses. And I just want to emphasize one thing that Representative Payne said. His father was a highly educated man who could easily have gotten screening. But if the government is putting out communication that says don't get screened or something wishy-washy like we now have for prostate cancer, talk to your doctor to see about the risks and benefits, then even highly educated men are likely not to go get screened. So we need to make sure that we have the setup and process in place via a bill like the USPSTF Transparency and Accountability Act for the government to make sure it's putting out the most accurate and up-to-date and comprehensive information about screening.
And I will just say that the task force has made positive changes, but again, they're not permanent at this point, so we need them put into a law, and that's for the benefit of all the patients and men in the United States.
Just want to recommend annual screenings and talking with your health professional and making sure you get the best advice.
I'll simply echo what my colleagues have said, and in particular, for those of you who work with men congressional people, tell them, go in and get screened. You just heard that's great talk. Go in and get screened. Thank you.
And I want to, really emphasize the fact that in our everyday work, a lot of us work for men's health organizations, or in your work as staffers to your bosses, we really need to focus on getting men that we know, men that we work with, to take advantage of these screenings, especially those that do not fall within the 50 to 69 age range for the grade C. There are men who are younger who have been diagnosed with prostate cancer. As we have said, there are no signs or symptoms. It's just a matter of knowing your family history. So we need to make sure we're advocating for people to get to know their family history and to ask the right questions, to make sure that they're talking to their physicians, talking to their family about the different health issues that they have, educating one another, going to briefings like this, working with organizations like ours. If you do know any organizations, Tony has a church that he mentioned he works with and does prostate cancer talks. Educating the general population is great. We can't stress enough how much women play a role in men's health, and getting the woman to, nag her husband or her father to go to the doctor and get his screening. So it's very important that we are aware and we keep abreast of all the new things that are coming out from the task force. So as we had mentioned earlier, the task force recommendations, the comments have already been put in, so they're currently reviewing. So hopefully towards the end of this year, beginning of next, we will get the final recommendation, and then, in 5 years, we may be back here and hearing even better news. But for now, we want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the panel of speakers for joining me today, and thank Congressman Payne Jr. for joining us and giving us his story. If anyone has any questions, we will be around, so please feel free to stick around, grab some lunch, and come chat. Thank you so much.